Right, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the final session of today of our ELT conference. Just a final thank you of course to our sponsors, Trinity College London and Macmillan Education, who have made this free event possible. As you've probably heard, the recording is being made of this session, so it'll be on the English UK website either towards the end of next week or the week after, so have a look out for that. We'll be sending you a link for that. If you want to ask Silvana any questions during her session, please pop them into the chat box, and she might be asking you to put a few other things into the chat box as well, so be aware of that. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Silvana Richardson, in case you do not know her and in case her fame does not precede her. She's Head of Education at Bell UK. And she has an unbelievable 35 years of experience as a teacher, teacher trainer, inspector, teacher educator, academic manager, consultant, and probably some other roles that I've left out as well. She's been in the past a director of the online Delta and has a forthcoming book. So this is something to look out for. Published by Cambridge University Press, naturally, it'll be a book on professional development. So Silvana, I'll leave you to introduce your session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ewan, for that lovely introduction. So hello, everybody from the beauty and majestic city of Cambridge. So let's get started. I was just
Silvana, we seem to have lost your sound.
Seem to have lost your voice.
No, still can't hear you. You haven't pulled out the headset or anything.
hello, can you hear me?
Yes, got you.
Yes,
got you
you're back.
Thank you.
You're back.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry about that. Anyway, so I was saying that when I was when I wrote the blurb for this session, I had written collaborative approaches for learning and innovating together. And as I was actually preparing the session, I realized that I really wanted, sorry about this, I really wanted to go for depth and to say more about less. So rather than go for collaborative approaches, I've decided to go for a collaborative approach for learning and innovating together and actually look at it in a little bit more depth. So in order for us to get started, I would like us to do a little bit of a kind of a warmer with myself. So I would invite you to think about your own experiences of learning with others, i.e. colleagues, and from others. So if you want to think for a minute about what was the last thing that you learned from a colleague, if you can remember that, but also was it a practical idea? So for example, an activity or something more like a concept or a procedure. And if it was something that you could implement in your class, whether you actually used it in your classes or not. And if you didn't use it, what stopped you? So I'll let you think for a minute on that one. And I'm going to add a second question, which is a little bit more general. So in your experience, what professional development activities, so what things we do to learn, are the most conducive for learning with and from colleagues? So let me give you an example. Quite a few teachers say the water cooler moment in the staff kitchen or in the staff room, where you just talk to a colleague and there's an aha moment. So can I invite you to type your thoughts either on the first question or on the second question, but help us by typing 1 if you're answering the first question or 2 if you're answering the second question. I'll give you a few minutes to type your answers. Thank you. For those of you who have just joined us, we're thinking about the questions that you can see on the screen, and I have invited you to either answer the first or the second question and just write the number. So if you're answering question 1, type 1. Thank you. I'll give you a couple more minutes so that I can see a few more ideas. At the moment, I can see 2 ideas. Okay, so I can see some answers. So activities which encourage us as learners. So that's answer to question 2. Activities that get us to do things and share with colleagues. So active learning in both cases. George, hello, George, you say co-coaching. Lydia says using more technology and apps. So that was the last thing you learned from a colleague. Lydia, can you tell us whether you implemented it or not and how it was? Thank you. Alex, activities that encourage us to collaborate with others and share ideas. So it sounds like, another answer to question 1, a procedure, right? Always schedule 5 minutes before and after meetings in your diary, allow the time for reflection. That's a really good one, Nicola. Thank you for that. Yes, very clearly we are a group of a kind that we all value active learning, and we all seem to value the collaborating with colleagues. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's move on. So that was a bit of a warmer to get you thinking. Let me just share with you the plan for the session. So first of all, I would like to share very briefly what the latest findings of the best available evidence have to say about effective collaboration as a professional development technique for teachers or activity. Then I wanted to share a collaborative approach for learning and innovating, which we have tried in my organization, and I've shared with other teachers, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. And then there will be time for questions and answers. Okay, so let's get started with the first part. So what research has to say about effective collaboration. Well, the first thing that you may not be surprised is that in a lot of the literature about how teachers learn and develop as professionals, there are, of course, mentions and comments about collaboration. And I think there's quite a bit of consensus in the literature that peer support, and sometimes called practical social support, may promote development. Interesting choice of auxiliary, may promote development. More about this in a minute. And the reasons why collaboration among teachers may promote development is that when you're working with peers, particularly if you belong to the same organization or the same geographical region, we share a common language, but we also share a culture, either a national or regional culture or an organizational culture. So we've got this in common. And also we share knowledge about how the organization works and the problems that we face. So we're kind of all on the same page about that. But also the importance of a colleague being able to provide emotional support, i.e. empathy, being a sounding board, being an ear, etc. But equally informational assistance, so help me, guide me, advise me, mentor me, that supports a teacher in improving their practice. So this is the finding from the latest, one of the latest pieces of meta research. More about this in a minute, by Collin and Smith. So I would like to define what I mean here by effective collaboration. Now, I will define here effective collaboration as a feature in professional development programs. So when teachers, not in a professional development program, when teachers get together and decide to learn together, but that collaborative learning allows teachers to implement what they're learning or what they have learned to their actual teaching practice. It expands their teaching repertoire, and that hopefully leads to better student learning. So there's a clear, if you like, influence between the collaborative activity between teachers, what they learn, and how they apply that to their own practice, and how that impacts on their students by improving their learning. That's what I mean. So in other words, what I mean by effective collaboration is that it has an impact on our students and their learning. Okay, so as I said, let me share a little bit about what research has to say about collaboration. And when I say research, I don't just mean one or two little studies here and there. What I mean here is, research that summarizes, thousands of teachers and lots of different studies. So, studies that look at teachers working together and collaborating in different settings and across as well phases of education. So what has this research has to say? Well, the most interesting and perhaps striking finding is that not all forms of collaboration between teachers are equally impactful. So what do I mean by that? That collaboration is really necessary for us to learn and develop, but it is not sufficient in itself. And it's linked to both positive outcomes, positive learning outcomes for teachers, but also negative learning outcomes. So depending on how you enact that collaboration, you may learn or it may not be beneficial for your learning. So it's really interesting to get to the bottom of what is effective collaboration and what isn't. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so in order for us to try and remember what effective collaboration, or what the ingredients, if you like, are of effective collaboration, I created a little, hopefully memorable word. This image of, seeping. So the professional development through collaboration kind of penetrating and filtering, because the letters in that word give you the key ingredients of effective collaboration. So the first one is that effective collaboration between colleagues in, teaching colleagues is structured. And by this, what I mean is that it's structured around supporting, me supporting my colleagues, but at the same time, me being supported by my colleagues. Now, what the researchers said here is not necessarily that unplanned collaboration, the one that happened, the water cooler moment, I have this idea in the staff room. The informal collaboration is ineffective. They're not saying that. What they're saying is that kind of collaboration is difficult to measure. And we can't deny that we live in a world of accountability and having to say, having to prove sometimes professional development. So in that sense, structured collaboration is easier to measure. Okay, point number 2, or letter number 2, the E in SEEP. That effective collaboration is experimental. So it's at the service of teachers trying out, refining, and embedding new approaches together. So in other words, we collaborate in order to innovate. The third feature, if you like, the second E of SEEP, is that effective collaboration among teachers is evidence rich. And this refers not just to us looking at the research evidence and saying, oh, that would be interesting to try out. Fundamentally, I mean, that's true, but fundamentally, what's more important here is that teachers generate the evidence by studying how students are responding to the changes once they start enacting an innovation. And the P, the final feature, if you like, is that collaboration, when it is effective, is problem-based. In other words, is focused on inquiry and problem solving. So here are some quotes that elaborate on these ideas. So I'll let you read the first one. I'll be silent for a second. So Professor Mary James says that when collaboration has this kind of inquiry focus on the classroom is the most potent element of professional development. And again, illustrating that idea of problem-based. So it's about tackling a real issue that we have, a real problem that we have, and we try to develop practical solutions together, sometimes looking at the research evidence ideally. This idea that it involves a cycle of action research or an inquiry cycle of investigation, action, evaluation, and refinement. I'm sure that some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the idea of action research. If you are good, long friends of English UK, you will know that English UK for at least, I think, 4 years. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think around the year 2015 or 14, they set up a very interesting action research scheme. So to enable teachers to collaborate and to do this kind of research, action research. Effective collaboration also, and here this is Philip According saying that it is about this idea of working through and reviewing together the effect, the impact of activities that are innovative, that disturb the status quo. And it's through doing this that we review our own approaches, our own assumptions and beliefs through a fresh and reflective pair of eyes. So this idea that we experiment with something new when we collaborate. Santoro, looking at the supportive nature of effective collaboration, Doris Santoro says that whenever teachers are brought together to investigate, to find solutions, and to develop new approaches, interventions, we are creating opportunities for an authentic community and for taking action in a way that feels less isolating. And I think this is particularly important now as we are transitioning out of the pandemic and we spend such a long time isolated and not near enough our colleagues. Really important. Okay, looking again at the research, what they propose is different models, if you like, or different ways of collaborating from a continuum from the most kind of expert type of collaboration, which is usually more extensive and more expensive, to a kind of more basic collaboration. So let me show you 3 types here along this continuum. So on the end, that is a more expert kind of collaboration between peers, you can have a coaching relationship that George was talking about. So an expert coach providing peer support and assistance to a peer. A second model would be, for example, regular conference calls if you're working online, or regular meetings between teachers. So this would be based on peers discussing as they're innovating, how they're finding learning, innovating, what the challenges are, how they're working through the challenges, etc. So that there's that kind of social support, but practical support. And then at the most basic level, it could be, for example, at least 2 colleagues taking part in a training, attending a conference or a course or whatever, and then not leave it at that, but to support each other as they're implementing and through the difficulties of implementation, coming together and discussing it and finding more solutions. So that's Collin and Smith, 2021. Okay, now, I think it's, as I said before, it's equally important to understand what is not effective collaboration. So what does research say about unimpactful collaboration? One thing is that collaboration is not effective when it just focuses on describing or sharing existing practicing rather than refining new ones. So collaboration is not leading to innovation, it's leading to persevering in the status quo. The second point here is that it focuses on teaching rather than students learning. So it's a focus on me, my technique, my board, but we're not necessarily thinking on whether my students are actually doing anything with my beautiful boards that I spend hours producing. So we, it doesn't really look at the effects of that new technique or strategy on my learners and their learning. And then collaboration is not effective when it builds a professional learning community as an end in itself, rather than as an environment in which it is safe to explore evidence. So it's a little bit like tea and cakes, which is beautiful. And I've been, I've had tea and cakes with my colleagues many times and thoroughly enjoy them, but that's not the point of collaboration for professional development. Okay. And let me stop for a minute and consider something which I have seen quite often in professional development, or opportunities when teachers gather together to share good practice. And I want to explore why this idea of sharing good practice can be, and very often is, an impactful collaboration. Right, so the first thing is, just for a minute, just think about this concept of good practice is a little bit problematic, because when we say good practice, what does that mean? Good practice for whom? According to whom? In what context? In what sector? Anyway, but this could be also described as what I sometimes call death by here's another one. So these sessions where, for example, a 60-minute session where for the first 20 minutes, one of the teachers, Danny, shares, what he has done using Canva with his students and how it's worked, etc., etc. And then comes Maria, who's been using Mentimeter with her own student and speaks to us for another 20 minutes about what she's done. And then off comes Florencia talking about using Padlet for another 20 minutes. And at the end of the 60 minutes, what we get is excessive cognitive load and very superficial coverage. So we may have some ideas and we may have some inspiration, but a lot of the time it's a little bit like an idea attack that doesn't actually necessarily teach me how to do things. And here I want to share very briefly some writing done by Weston and Clay on what teachers learn for, because it's going to help us understand why sharing good practice is an impactful collaboration. So David Weston and Bridget Clay say that teachers, first of all, learn in order to understand concepts, new concepts, theories, be aware of new ideas. And this they call, we learn for awareness and for inspiration. And there's a lot of need sometimes for inspiration when you have been teaching for quite a while and you find yourself doing the same things. You absolutely need inspiration. Nothing wrong with that. Then also teachers need to learn to operate systems, to follow procedures, techniques, strategies, etc. And this they call use and application. So somebody in the chat room was talking about apps and technology. Well, there's an element of, it's not just about what is it, but also how does it work? And then implement, refine and evaluate and embed new practices, because we don't want to try something out or spend a lot of time learning something new if we're not going to implement it into our practice and expand our teaching repertoire as a result. And this is the kind of teacher learning that actually produces direct impact on our learners and their learning. So let's have a look at this with an example. I'm going to use the example of a group of teachers learning about hybrid teaching. And I've chosen this example because it's an example that is kind of fresh in my mind. We had to learn at Bell in my schools to teach hybridly. But this is not the point. The point isn't talking about hybrid teaching. The point here is how teachers learned and, at what levels they learned. So as you listen to my description, can I ask you to think about the following question? If in your experience of learning as a professional, the professional development activities typically go this deep in supporting you to enact what you learn in your practice. In other words, when you do your CPD sessions, go or attend a webinar or do a course, do you go this deep? And does it really enable you to apply what you learn to your teaching? So let's have a look at awareness and inspiration. So in the case of hybrid teaching, this would be something along the lines of, what is hybrid teaching and learning? I need to understand that. What does successful hybrid teaching and learning look like? I need to see models to understand. What are the benefits, but more importantly, what are the challenges of hybrid teaching and learning? Because unless I'm aware of what the problems can be, I'm not ready or equipped to find solutions. And how can we address the challenges in our context? So a localization of this, this approach, and start thinking about my own school, my own learners, my own practice. So this is only level 1. Now then, of course, all this we can learn together. So collaboration here is about learning with colleagues, all these things. Then we move on to level 2, use and application. So after we've done level 1, then if I want to actually teach using hybrid technology, I need to understand and I need to be able to use a procedure for hybrid teaching. So I need to be looking at web conferencing software like Zoom, hardware like the webcam, etc., to teach hybrid lessons. But it's not just that I understand that 1, I turn on my computer, and 2, etc. It's about trying out the procedure, troubleshooting and problem solving, because 1,001 things can go wrong with technology, as we all know. Then over to the pedagogy and the room and the virtual environment. So I need to start thinking about seating arrangements, cam placement in my own classroom. So can the online students see my in the room students, if you like, and can my students in the room see the online learners, and are they having difficulty listening to each other, and how am I going to go about pair work and group work? So all this I need to consider and might need to test and ask colleagues to come in and play the role. This is what we did in my organization. When we started testing hybrid technology, there were 7 of us trying to test it, because we needed to understand the context and how it was working for us. And then, of course, we move on to the pedagogy of joint lesson planning, getting our heads around what happens in the virtual environment, what happens in the face-to-face environment. And of course, then peer reviewing lessons together and giving each other feedback. So here is where we see the collaboration happening. This is only level 2. Now, if I really want to embed this in my practice, embed, not just use once. So use it confidently, competently, so that my students can learn. Then, of course, I need to implement, but also I need to start capturing and noticing how my students are reacting, how it's affecting them and their learning. And here there is the potential for collaboration, for example, in peer observation, either in the room or video observation. But more importantly, there's the evaluation section, if you like, of reflecting on lessons learned, sharing issues and challenges with my colleagues, raising questions, developing solutions together. So this really bombed. What can we do? For example, my students, there was a divide in the class. So I had my online students working here and I had my face-to-face student. How can I break down this barrier between the real and we start thinking about how we can go about it. And of course, planning the next stages. Now, this is all about collaboration. This is all about thinking, learning, innovating together. So I don't want you to answer this, but just think about how deep the training that you've received of late has gone into these 3 aspects. And this is why I say that sharing good practice is not necessarily the most impactful form of collaboration. Because what happens in a session like that is that you get awareness on inspiration, so ideas, but you don't necessarily get to the application. So how do I actually do this? And of course, you don't have the chance to experiment, and you don't have the chance to be supported and to support your colleagues. So let's now focus on a collaborative approach for learning and innovating. As I said, this is what the evidence says. It's a useful model. However, as I said before, it's very intensive and very expensive, especially right now. So there's a lot of paying the expert, a lot of arranging for cover, which is not necessarily, right now, the most convenient way of going about professional development, particularly as there have been lots of budget cuts in CPD, etc., etc. So what I want to share with you is what I wrote and called the 6D cycle. If you want to know more about this, there will be a publication in July called Better Learning Research Review, and there will be a chapter on the 6D cycle. Let me tell you what the 6Ds stand for, and then I will describe them one by one. By the way, don't worry, the first 3 Ds are a little longer, the last 3 Ds are much shorter. So firstly, discover, decide, design, do, debrief, and disseminate. What I want to stress here is that you don't need your director of studies to organize this for you. You don't need an expert to come and teach you about it. You can actually set this up with peers and colleagues face to face or working online together. Okay, so discover. Discover is this idea of problem-based about effective collaboration. So we're focusing on inquiry and problem solving. So first we discover, or we think about, what problem are we trying to solve in our practice? And what could we try? And the operative word here is could. So there are many things we could try. And what's out there that has been shown to be effective, so ideally research-based, that might be beneficial for our students. So this is an exploration, a discovery phase. Now, there are many sources of awareness and inspiration that you can look at, and I'm sure you've done in the past, from papers, that kind of translate, if you like, or mediate research for an audience and readership of teachers, like the Cambridge papers in ELT, the Oxford papers in ELT, books, chapters from books, articles, blog posts, webinar and webinar recordings, conference sessions, podcasts, inset sessions, tweet meets, just interesting conversations that can kind of trigger that discovery. The collaboration here is what structures that support, and it would be around sharing with colleagues or discussing innovative practices. So you've read chapters together, let's come and discuss what implications there are for my own context, or some of us does the attending the webinar, the conference, does the reading and then presents it to others, and then you discuss the implications. The question here that we want to answer is, would it be viable for our students and for us in our school and class at this particular time, to implement any of these possible approaches? This is an example from my own context. Quite recently, our teachers decided, we decided together that we wanted to focus more and more carefully on giving feedback to students on their written work. What was the problem? The problem, this may be familiar to you, that we spend hours and hours marking written work. However, that students don't always look at the corrections, very seldom indeed sometimes, and that the feedback doesn't always lead to improvements in writing. So therefore, we don't have a return on that investment of hours and hours of marking that it doesn't affect the students or effect very much of a change or an upgrade in the language development. So we wanted to look at sources of inspiration. So we looked at the evidence base, and we looked at two sources from general education. So that a chapter on feedback from visible learning, feedback on written feedback. We looked at a guidance report, teacher feedback to improve pupil learning from the Education Endowment Foundation. And we also looked at the section of the chapter in An Introduction to Evidence-Based Teaching in the English language classroom. And these were all short, easy, clear, with concrete examples. So we weren't reading massive research reports. So stage number 2, decide. So here we move on from what could we do to what are we going to do, and how are we going to prepare for that experimentation or implementation. So here we move from exploring alternatives to commitment to action. In other words, we're going to set conscious and specific goals. The collaboration here is discussing together our decisions and our goals, and to get peer feedback with that sounding board that is my colleague that can challenge my thinking. Questions that are worth asking each other would be, are my goals specific enough? What else should I be doing? What am I not seeing? The preparation here is really important. So thinking about deciding how we're going to prepare together. This is often overlooked. We rush to implementation way too soon. And what happens is that sometimes implementation falls as a result. So here we need to be thinking about, okay, what is it that I need to learn to use confidently? For example, technology. What models do I need to explore? So if I'm looking, as I said before, at a new technique, I need to see what it looks like. Do I need to rehearse this? Do I need feedback from my peers on my rehearsal and practice. And the collaboration during the preparation here could be that we explore together models, that we explore together techniques, that we explore together the technology. Also that we become practice or rehearsal buddies. So for example, my peers help me because we kind of rehearse some team teaching together, or they become my pretend students so that I can rehearse and they play the role of students and then they give me a little bit of feedback, or both, and then the peer feedback. So back to my example of giving feedback to students on their written work, we have decided that the most suitable types of techniques, because of the context, were the techniques that appeared in the book on evidence-based teaching in English language, in the English language classroom. So we looked at those. And these were the goals that our teachers set. And interestingly, they were different for different teachers. And it depended on what they were using already, because they wanted to implement with something new. So for example, some of them decided to try direct correction, where rather than just underlining and letting the student think of what the right, version is, you just correct the error. If the teachers were used to indirect correction, or to focus on focus feedback, i.e., I'm going to look at narrative tenses rather than every single error there is in the paper, if teachers were used to unfocused feedback. So what happened here is that the goals were relevant to individual teachers, and that was really great. The preparation here was quite easy. We needed to explore models of what the techniques that they wanted to develop look like. So what does good direct correction look like? What does focus feedback look like? And then we practiced using the strategy. So for example, we gave mock feedback on written work using the chosen strategy, and then we gave each other peer feedback. And the focus of the peer feedback was something along the lines of, was my feedback direct or specific enough? What worked well, that's a WWW, and even better if. So giving each other ideas about what else they could have done. But this was quite straightforward in our case. Moving on to the design. Now here we need to design two things, the implementation and the evaluation. So what are we going to do, and how will we know that what we're doing is impacting our learners? This is very easy. We're not doing a PhD here. So we're thinking about which class am I going to experiment with? When is the right moment when I'm ready and I'm ripe and I've done all my preparation to actually implement this innovation? For how long are we going to do this? And how are we going to do this? So in my example, this was very easy. So we've decided to go for morning rather than afternoon classes, A, because we have more hours with the students, and second, because we set more written homework. Because what we needed to learn and develop, the techniques, were very simple, we just decided next week. But if you're thinking about something much more complex, you need to spend more time preparing. We decided to do this for a month, and then to implement the strategy and to collect information. More about this in a minute. The second part of the design is the evaluation, and this is again a reminder of effective collaboration as evidence-rich collaboration, where the teachers study how the students are responding to the challenges. So here again, as I said, this is not a PhD. We don't need massive sources of data. We need to ask ourselves, how will I find out that our students are responding to this innovation, and what information will I need to collect? So in our example, for example, we've decided to save samples of students' work with our written feedback, and not samples of every single one of my students' work, but to focus on random samples of 1 or 2 or 3 students, no more. We're busy, we've got a lot of planning to do. We can't spend forever analyzing data. And then to refer back when we mark the next piece of work, has the student that I'm looking at taken the previous corrections on board? Is there improvement in the written work or not? The collaboration again here is joint planning, plan the implementation together, talk to each other, discuss peer feedback. Stage 4, do. Not much to say about this. So here is where we experiment, where we try out and we refine our new approaches. So we implement the innovation and we collect the information that we talked about, for the evaluation. Stage 5, debrief, And this is where, again, we get dirty with the information and we study how the students are responding to the changes. So we look at how well is it working? How well did it work? Did it lead to better learning? And if so, how? Is it worth developing further and sharing this with more colleagues? And if the answer is yes, then I move on to stage, well, before I move on to stage 6, collaboration here again is using my peer as a sounding board and as a critical friend, and my peer doing, coming to me for that. So asking provocative questions, seeking clarification, challenging supportively, etc. If we are happy that there's mileage here to share this with a wider audience, then we disseminate. In other words, we show other colleagues, we tell our colleagues about it for their awareness and for their inspiration. Collaboration here is, us working together, producing a session for our colleagues, or an article, or a blog post, or a podcast, or a video. There are so many different ways in which we can disseminate findings. But more importantly, dissemination is collaboration with the wider field, is when we open our learning for others. So my last comment about this is that it's in your power. This is something that any teacher can do. Any group of teachers can do together. So I would encourage you to try it out. It gives you the structure and those elements of effective collaboration that you need for the collaboration to be effective. And if you are a manager and you're listening, or a teacher educator and you're listening, again, I would encourage you to create the conditions for your teachers to collaborate in this way. So over to questions and answers, if you have any.
Thanks, Silvana. That was a really stimulating talk. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat box like you did before, or alternatively, you could put your camera on, take yourself off mute and ask a question verbally, the old-fashioned way.
End of the day.
Yeah, it's been a long day, I think. Well, I mean, what I found really interesting was the idea that perhaps teachers could collaborate without necessarily being directed from the top down, so they can get together and give them an approach, the kind of 6D approach, or whatever they want, however they might want to change that perhaps a little bit in order to just work things out for themselves. I mean, I guess they could do it across institutions as well.
Of course. And also, for those teachers in other contexts where they are alone, you can work with teachers from other organizations. So, in special interest groups or with your friends that work in other schools, this collaboration online is perfectly possible. But yes, you're right. This is about, the 6D cycle gives teachers the little bit of structure that sometimes, because collaboration then sometimes can get a little bit chaotic, and it can become a little tea and cakes if we don't have a structure that, to work through it. It can happen.
Yeah, this is what we found with the Action Research Project. There were lots of teachers out there wanting to do this kind of thing, but they didn't necessarily have a guide or a route through it. So I think, talks like yours are really, really useful. And I think it's, but with fewer teachers in schools, perhaps we do need to think about sort of some way to link people up together so that people can collaborate with others in other parts of the world, perhaps, or in other towns. Yeah. Cool. Right. Anyone else got any comments that they'd like to make, or anyone want to reveal themselves at the end of the day? Otherwise, we're close to the witching hour, 5 o'clock, so we can wrap things up. But just a big thank you to Silvana and all our speakers today and yesterday. Of course, Trinity College London and Macmillan Education for sponsoring this event as well. Siobhan for putting it all together. It's been a really stimulating day. So, and to Eleanor for managing the sessions as well. She's not here this week, but she was working on it previously. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. Thanks again, Silvana. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.